All right, so I'm just gonna do kind of a thinking out loud on the movie Red Dawn, and we're talking the original that came out in the '80s with Patrick Swayze and Tommy Howell, and among people Jennifer Grey. And if you're not familiar, there was a film called Red Dawn, came out in the early mid '80s. I couldn't tell you the year right now, and I've seen it 1,000 times. I'll be happy to watch it 1,000 more before I die. But the premise is back in the '80s, the Soviet Union teams up with Cubans and they invade the United States. And so, like has happened so many times all over the world, the United States gets invaded, and the story follows a group of. It's Patrick Swayze, who might have been in his mid, maybe late 20s at the time. They really don't give an age for the character. And then all the other kids are high school. So Patrick Swayze's brother, who played by Charlie Sheen, Matt, he's in high school, and when this invasion happens, and you have Russians parachuting down into I believe it was supposed to be, it was shot in New Mexico, but I believe it was supposed to be Colorado, near the Rockies. And so Patrick Swayze, who just dropped off his brother at high school, um, runs back in his truck to pick up his brother and ends up rescuing it was four guys, if I got the math right on that. And then they go to a gas station owned by, I think it was Tommy Howell's character's dad, and they grab a bunch of supplies, and then they head up into the Rockies to get away from this invasion. And people are being, in the opening scene, a school teacher is gunned down by the Russians, and then several high school students. You see like one guy's, dead body hanging out a window. So people are being massacred, and this group of ends up being six guys, goes up into the Rockies to hide from that. They then go to a familiar family that lives in the middle of nowhere that has two young women. I believe they're again supposed to be like high school age, and so it ends up being eight. They end up becoming partisans, and so they're guerrilla fighters fighting the Russians and the Cubans. And so if you're under the age of 30, this was all the film again called Red Dawn. It was made when the Cold War was still piping hot, and there was legit concern about a war with Russia, World War III, nuclear war, and it was made right in the midst of all that. And so it's a very I don't. So I've been watching several reactions, and what's interesting now, it's younger people. I saw this when I was a kid, watched it many times during the '80s, many times since, and so now that I'm watching these reviews for Red Dawn by young adults who are in their early 20s now, and it's interesting the difference in perspective, because of course the Cold War's long since over, and you could look at that and say, "Come on, that wouldn't happen." All that kind of stuff, and it's very divisive. The people who love it, like me, they love it, and at best, they're just kind of like, it's not that hot, it's not that great. But so I've been watching these reviews, and it's interesting the different take, because I think the younger people just don't understand the Cold War. And you can look back, you can Monday morning quarterback and say we never went to war with Russia. There was never World War III as of the making of this video. But that wasn't so easily dismissed at the time. And so that was something that, speaking as a kid of the '80s, that was something that was like a legitimate concern. What if we have to go to war? And Vietnam was, only maybe a decade. The war in Vietnam ended in '75. This is the early '80s. That's still in the rearview mirror. And I remember that about the '80s, watching a show like Tour of Duty, which is about the war in Vietnam. And it's like that just happened. And there were guys, that I knew that were only in their 30s who were non-vets. And it's like, it was still fresh. And now Vietnam is so deep into the past, there's really no, you don't get that sense of concern and urgency anymore. And then young people today would be like, what was 9/11? It's like, We went back to what the film was about. We've gone back to what the film was about was in the United States, you don't have to worry about what's going on in the rest of the planet. We got Israel and Palestine, you got Russia and Ukraine. Well, that's way over there, you see. It really doesn't affect us. We're in the post 9/11 world. It's like suddenly we're connected to what's happening geopolitically everywhere. And so it's kind of fascinating to see people's perspective on this. But one of the criticism I saw, and this was a popular criticism, is that Red Dawn was like a pro-war, right-wing, let's go shoot 'em up some Ruskies type of film. And I've always seen Red Dawn as less of a political stance, like you're on the political left or the political right, or pro-war versus anti-war. I've always seen Red Dawn as more of a philosophical question. If this happened to you, what would you do? You know, could you kill your fellow man to defend your home and defend your families? And again, unless I'm missing something, since 1812, we haven't had to deal with that here in the United States. And an out and out. Oh, of course, the Civil War. What am I thinking? 1865, Civil War concludes. We haven't had a full-on war since, a long time ago. And we've been protected by oceans on both sides, friendly countries in the north and south, in Canada and Mexico. And so we've always, since at least World War I era, we've had a very capable military, very capable of defending ourselves. And we've always taken to fight to other people's countries. And so we're just not familiar with what much of the world has to deal with, which is the possibility of civil wars, revolutions, and being invaded and occupied by other countries. And in every turn, when that happens, the average citizen has to take up arms to defend their homes and defend their people and their country. And so it's fascinating to watch that kind of ebb and flow over. As I'm now getting old as shit. I'll be 42 here in a couple 3 weeks. And I've just seen that come and go, where we go with 9/11. We're like, oh my God, are there going to be more attacks like this and all this stuff? And now that's kind of yesterday's news, psychologically speaking. And so that's how I've always interpreted Red Dawn, was not a for or against, like it didn't come down hard on pro-war or anti-war. It was more, if this were to happen here, what would that look like? What would that be like? And what would you do? Would you submit to your conquerors peacefully, or would you take up arms and fight? And what are the consequences? And one thing everybody's like, this is a pro-war movie, and it's like, okay, let's do a head count of how many people survive. It's like nobody. Of the partisans, they pick up the colonel at one point, and they're up to 9 people. It had to be 10 because it was called 10 men at one point. I'd have to do that count. So it's you got 9 or 10 partisans fighting the Ruskies, and then 2 of them walk out at the end of the film. Like everybody else gets killed. Spoiler, but that's and it's pretty brutal. I mean, their families are murdered. There's one scene where the locals, who are the relations of these fighters, these high school kids, get lined up and gunned down to punish and there's a lot of civilians getting slaughtered, attempting to be slaughtered. They're watching their families being brutally executed. It's like, that's hardly supporting war. Like, it's a positive thing. Now, the score, which is fantastic in this film, very subtle in some points, very energetic in others, has like this high school football team music to it. But again, it's presenting both sides. So it's like at different times they're ambushing the Russians and they're winning the fight, which is much of the movie. But then, once the Russians get a new commander, and I'm not going to go too deep in the film, but they start turning the tables on these partisans, and partisans start taking casualties. So it's like, in my opinion, it's something of a satire. It's like, here's what you think it would be like. You go up into the mountains, you get a hand on a bunch of guns, You live off the woods. It's sexy as hell. You got two pretty girls, and then you're gonna go kill up a shit ton of Ruskies. But oh wait, because they shoot back, and you're gonna, hardly anybody's getting out of this thing. So it's. I see it as more like, if you were to take up that position of being a guerrilla fighter and a partisan, um, the bad things are coming down the road, and that's the tone that the film ends on. Only two people survive. Um, so it's like, yeah, you might get some of what you'd want that to be, which is like you got two hot chicks with you. You're living in the woods. You're shooting up some Ruskies. You're blowing shit up, kicking ass and taking names, and then most of you ain't living this thing. So that's how I always saw the film as more of an open-ended philosophical question that doesn't. It asks questions, it presents evidence, but it doesn't tell you what the answer is. Um, should you fight back, or shouldn't you? If you do, here's what's going to happen to you. If you don't, here's what So the people that didn't go to fight, they were put in the equivalent of. They were called re-education camps, which were like concentration camps, and like the two lead guys, Patrick Swayze and Charlie Sheen's dad, he gets killed. He's put in a concentration camp. He's, they see him again, he's covered in blood. He's been beaten up really bad. And then they end up executing him and dozens of people. So it's like, if you don't fight, they're going to torture you and kill you. They're going to occupy your home. If you fight back, only two people are getting out. Whoop, sorry. So pick your poison. So to me, Red Dawn has always been less a statement, more of a philosophical question posed. If this were to happen here, what would that be like, and what would you do? But I don't see it as a film that. And then at the very end of the film, all they say is it's narrated by Leah Thompson, and she's like, "This war, like all wars, ended." They don't even say who won. Assumedly, the United States won because the flag is waving. But it's not a celebration of victory. It's a lament of what was lost. It ends on the frame. The partisans, when someone got killed, they would write their name on this boulder, on this rock, as a memorial. And so the film ends with a shot on that memorial. Here's what was lost. Hardly anybody got out. I don't see that as a rah, rah, rah pro-war movie. I see that as again, if you don't fight back, here's the consequences. If you do fight back, here's the consequences. It's bad either way. And then the Cuban colonel, who's been like hardcore, he's leading these attacks. By the end of the film, he's disgusted with what he's become and what he's done. So it's not just the Americans and what they got to go. And that's one of the brilliant parts of Red Dawn, is it shows you both sides. You got the Cuban leadership, and at least there's one Russian leader that you get to know it all. He gets killed, the Russian guy, spoiler. And then the Cuban guy's like, by the end of the film, he's like, what have we done? He used to be like, let's go get him, just like Patrick Swayze's character. They parallel each other very well. They're like, let's win one for the home team. And so I can see why people see that, but that's the satire. Here's the philosophical positions presented at the beginning of the film, and then we turn that on its head, and here's the flaws in that thinking. Here are the consequences of this. And so by the end of the film, Colonel Buela, the Cuban colonel, is like, what did we turn ourselves into by doing this? We're murdering, these are high school kids, we're murdering high school kids. So I think it's an excellent film that's a philosophical debate of a film, but not a film that takes a hardened stance on what you should and shouldn't do, and what you should and shouldn't believe. And so it's interesting for people to see that and have that take. And it's like, there's one, I should have, as always, I should have done some research. One young guy in his early 20s, white dude, I was watching his review, and that's what kind of set that off. And he's like, I can't get behind the message of the film. And if I was less of an asshole, I'd write and kind of like, what was the message of the film? and his take by deduction was like a pro-war message, and I'm like, was it? Was this pro-war? You know, several characters. Like, so there's these juxtapositions. There's the one kid, the scrawny, whiny white kid, who's like, at one point, he's like, Colonel, are we doing right? And it's just like, his delivery. That was not a good performance. But and then you have Tommy Howell's character, Robert, who his whole family got killed, and he's out for blood. Including when one of the guys turns out to be a traitor and he kills his own, throughout the film, he kills his own best friend. Cold, emotionless, no regret. He becomes so hardcore in his hatred that he loses his sense of humanity, and then he gets taken out towards the end of the film. And then the character is like conflict, so that it's not necessarily who's right and who's wrong. I don't see the film as having presented and this is the correct position. It's a film that asks questions, and it presents you characters on both sides. It presents both sides of the conflict, and the different philosophies, pro-war, anti-war. And again, the consequences are two people make it out. That's it. Of all of them, and they lose their families. Their families get killed. Obviously, on the other side, the Russians and the Cubans are taking heavy casualties. The one guy gets blinded by the blast of an RPG. The exhaust comes out the back. That's the last you see of him. But that, if I'm interpreting that event right, that guy's going to walk around blind for the rest of his life. One of the Cuban, I think a general, gets blown up with an RPG. It's like, it's not just the good guys and the bad guys. Really, the Colonel Buela is the only guy who walks out unscathed physically, but he's damaged psychologically. He's haunted by this. And out of the partisans that you're following, two people. Out of all the characters, I don't know what happens to the mayor. They don't tell you what happens to the mayor of the town. Everybody else dies. So Colonel Buela, the mayor, and two of the partisans, everybody else dies. Except for the guy who got, his eyes got damaged by the blast. So that's not what a pro-war film is. Here's the consequences of being pro-war. So I wouldn't necessarily say, you could make a much stronger argument that it's an anti-war film. But again, I think some people don't understand the concept of satire. Satire is you present someone's political position, worldview, politics, and through the course of the events of the story, you turn it on its head and you say, and here's the flaws in that thinking, or at the very least, here's the consequences of the flaws of that thinking, or the consequences of that thinking. That's what a satire is. And then Red Dawn is a satire. Towards the very beginning of the film, where there's an attack going on, there's a dead body lying there holding a pistol, and it pans from you can't see what my hands are doing. It pans from the bumper sticker, and it says, "You'll get my gun when you take it from my cold dead hands." And that's the next thing that happens. A Russian takes the pistol out of the guy's hand, and so that's satire. People with that rah rah rah, let's go get the Ruskies mentality. Okay, but here's what that's gonna be. That's not pro-war. So the film doesn't say you should go peacefully and not defend yourself, but that's hardly a pro-war film. So it's interesting to see that take. Like the characters, Patrick Swayze's character, especially C. Thomas Howell, call it a pro-war, like Patrick Swayze's positions, we need to defend our home and our families. And C. Thomas Howell's character is like just out for fucking blood. Like, he doesn't care who wins and who loses anymore. Patrick Swayze wants to win to defend his home. Tommy Hall's character, Robert, doesn't give a red shit who wins this thing. He just wants vengeance. And it makes for very compelling characters. And then even with Patrick Swayze and Charlie Sheen's character, there's philosophical debate there, because there's one scene where they take some casualties, some people get killed. And then they're having this quiet conversation after all the chaos. They're up, and it's very well shot, very well made film. After all the fighting and the chaos, they're up in the mountains and there's nothing but the wind. And it's kind of like foreshadowing. I watched this back in the days. That just occurred to me. That scene is foreshadowing, because that's what's going to happen to these two brothers. Silence. They're not going to be here. But they're talking about some of the partisans are talking about quitting, except for Robert. And Patrick Swayze's like talking about the people got killed, and he's like, it's going to happen sooner or later. And Charlie Sheen is like, you're getting kind of thin on feelings, and Patrick Swayze's like, can't afford them. It's like, you just lost two of your friends, two good friends, and you can't afford compassion for that. And he can't. He has to lead. But that's not pro-war. That's going, if you do this, you're going to lose your humanity. You're going to lose that compassion, and there's a huge difference from the first time Patrick Swayze kills a guy, and they're face to face, and the guy's bleeding out, he's dying, and then you just hear the gunshot, but you see the absolute anguish on Patrick Swayze's face for the first time he's actually looking at a guy up close and personal. They've always been this mythical monster, the way it was presented. Someday when the Russians invade, you better be able to take up arms and take out them Ruskies. You better be ready. And then he's grown up in that mentality, and now he's face to face with an actual Russian, and it's just some guy. And you feel horrible for that guy. Great performances, great writing. That is not pro-war. That's just not that's reality of war. I'm just not seeing what other people are seeing, that this was a pro-war film somehow. Maybe war necessary, but not pro-war. So those are my thoughts on Red Dawn and the division that it created in its audience. But I'll do another one of these when I'm not sitting in a parking lot waiting for my sister to get back from a medical exam type of thing. She doesn't have a car. I have to drive her everywhere. But so I want to do one of those, do some reactions to other people's reactions, because I think it's Red Dawn. If you haven't seen it, Patrick Swayze, Tommy Howell, Leah Thompson, everybody, Charlie Sheen, everybody was in this one. Powers Booth, just a fantastic cast. Frickin' Shaft. So it's go check out Red Dawn if you haven't seen it. I like it. There's this guy who's kind of like if Hitler never killed anybody, he's like that. You know what I mean? And his name's Eric. He has a YouTube channel called Hey Internet Eric here, and he said he didn't like this film. And then he said he's a big fan of the movie Howard the Duck. So it's like, if you were still a Holocaust maniac, but you didn't kill the Jews, that's who he is. And so he was like, not for this film. And I'm just like, how? But you liked Howard the Duck? What? So anyway, we've had this discussion, Eric and I. We've known each other since the 90s. And he thought he was boring. And I'm like, boring? How? There's a lot of shooting in this film. So anyway, but it is interesting watching Red Dawn. Go check it out if you haven't seen it. But it's interesting to see the people who've watched it and which direction they go in. They're for or against, love it or hate it. And that's every film for sure, but I think that's part of the success of this film, is it makes you ask those questions. And, you can't watch Red Dawn and come away with a non-opinion. Like, it forces you to think, and that's the upside to Red Dawn. You have to ask, what if this happened? What if this happened to me and my family? So, anyway, check out Red Dawn, and like and subscribe on this video. And I'm starting a new job tomorrow. If you got $5, I've got a link I'll link in the description of my video for my PayPal. If I could get a couple $100 from people, I'm going to be in really good shape here. But it's going to be a while to have first paycheck, so it's going to be tight. So anyway, like and subscribe. If If you're doing Frosty, throw me a few bucks to help me out. And I'll see you guys on the next video. Cheers. It's still, I hit the button.